Anishinangi miniko sema, chiranoninan. Manito, hatsukana gaye, wapanong, shawanong ningabi anong, kiwetinong. Kimama nan gaye migwech, nindina. Migwech gaye, nindinag. Kagipimatisio atmeusha. Witukawushinam, minik kenipimatisiang.
This story is Gwayakochigewin, or Doing Things the Right Way, about leadership and governance. Vinesikwe, Nindigenikaz, Makwa, Indo Dam. Winona LaDuke from the White Earth Reservation. Madeline Island is the largest of the 12 Apostle Islands. It is situated in Lake Superior off northern Wisconsin. It is the final stopping place of the Anishinaabe Ojibwe migration westward, and it evolved into the spiritual and political center for the tribe, where gatherings and councils took place. Later, it became the place where treaties were signed with the Americans.
So this, to me, is a very, very sacred and important place. We're at the center of the North American continent, and you look at all the lakes. It's the heart of North America, and this is where the lifeblood of our Earth Mother here comes from.
Misa Jigwanigig Gaye Guiuzes Mada de Siwad. Gani Ja Chiwad o Mishom Sinaya Anishinabeg Ugiminawa Ino Guiuzesan Gichigash Kibijigan Ji Iju Duwad Anishinabe Ma. Nigig Gaye Guiuzes Gimeme Mashku Jiwag Bimebetuad Iwe Gichigash Kibijigan. Megwa bime wa yawad nijwaching gi nogishkawag. Enda soon nagishkawad gi uzesan ogi mawa windo magun inu manitun. Anin inwe nijwaching kagi min in the dwa ekaduag. Zagatuyan gi kendamawin, meje ane niba kwawin. Gi kendaman zagiyetewin, mi wenji be jimino iya wendi yang. Manan endan gakinagego manetuga gi ojitud. Zungidean ina sametimang janginiming. Debewen kiga onji zungide. The basen in the zuin, mi nawaji manitu wa de zian. Debewen biminja aman. Mi ji anigi kendaman onawen. Mi nigo wiziwanan.
Our people lived as independent, self-governing nations connected through a common language, religion, and culture for hundreds of years before the first European came to the Great Lakes region of North America. We were sovereign nations from the beginning.
In its essence, sovereignty means the power of self-government, the power to govern one's people in a way that conforms with the needs and the desires of a given people. Tribal people, in order to be self-governing and to understand who they are in relation to all the other native peoples, need to retain their cultural identity, and that includes language, which is the linchpin of sovereignty. It includes ceremonies. It includes the values. It includes whatever distinguishes that indigenous people from another group. Because the people that knows who they are and that knows their connection to the land that they emerge from, to the fish that they need to spear as part of their ceremonial life ways. That is a people, that is a nation, and they are someone who are unique in the world. It's self-governance, but it's self-governance that is rooted in or overarched by cultural integrity and dignity.
The cultural identity of Ojibwe individuals was based on the clan of their father, which was inherited at birth and remained until death. The clans or dodems were viewed as a gift from the Creator that originated in the spirit world and are represented by the characteristics of their animal counterparts in the physical world. Clan members could not marry within their own clan and had specific roles to carry out in the community.
My clan were considered the orators, the speakers, leaders, not necessarily chiefs, but a person who would stand before the group and let the people know what's on someone's mind. If you don't feel comfortable getting in front of a group and speaking about something, you would come and give my clan a gift, tell what's in your heart, and then a person from my clan would speak before the group and let the people know what is your concern. The Bear Clan was there to maintain order. If anyone gets out of hand, the Bear Clan's going to be there to maintain order. And if there's a Bear Clan man around, you never got out of line because you knew that they were there, and you just didn't mess with anything or anyone when there's a Bear Clan person around. Now, the Martin clan is if we have a dispute and we can't settle it and there's no resolution to it, I'll go over to the Martin clan and give them a gift. And once you know that I've given that gift to the Martin clan, you better take heed, because if I give them to deal with it, those are our warriors. And they will settle that dispute right now. And those Martin clan women, well, are generally what are referred to as the true peacemakers. They will settle the disputes. And they're not going to pick up a club and go hit you over the head. Their Martin clan man might do that, but they'll go out and they'll resolve something really quick. That's our warrior clan.
The Ogichida were those warriors that went out and protected the village. They were the men that showed in their actions the bravery and the fortitude and the ability to protect the people. They were the Ogichida. They held a high rank among the peoples, among the different bands of Anishinaabe.
Each and every clan had a head representative, a man and a woman. And there were definite laws that were given via the clan system. And the way that it worked and the way decisions were reached is that all decisions had to be total consent.
My knowledge of the past from the standpoint of how villages made decisions, how bands made decisions, is discussions amongst the members within the adult membership of issues that they was facing as a community. And as a result of that, the consensus was being built that supported decisions that were being made. So consensus building has always been a part of it.
And so the clan system, not only did it deliver skills, characteristics, tendencies in that manner, but it gave pattern, it gave reason, it gave logic to the people, and then became the basis for government, for governing ourselves.
Elders were the most highly respected individuals in the clans and the community. The wisdom of the elders was held in the highest regard.
It's something that is ingrained in all of us, and we all know that we must go speak to the elders. And when we ask them properly, when we give them tobacco and ask them to teach us, they do.
The most important aspect of decision-making for a leader was considering how each decision would impact 7 generations in the future.
In all deliberations that are before you as a leader, you first have to set aside your own interests in that decision. Then you have to set aside the interests of your family. And then all of the other people who are in your community. And when you do that, he said, you create a space. And he says, in that space, it's like a path, he said, that you create. And if you look down that path, and if you look really hard, you'll see a little baby. That little baby is the future. And it's 7 generations in the future. As a leader, you must weigh the decision that's before you as to its impacts it will have on that little baby. If it's good for that little baby, then it's going to be good for everything else.
As the European market for furs increased during the 1600s, French fur traders made their way deep into the Great Lakes region. They introduced foreign goods in exchange for furs.
They became very intensive hunters. They began killing off the animal life in particular regions. They began expanding farther and farther away, and that brought about intertribal hostilities and brought conflict, particularly with the Sioux.
Territorial conflicts with the Dakota Sioux continued as the French and later the English sought trade alliances with the Ojibwe.
From the first European arrival and their initial contacts with the tribes, and the competition that then erupted between the various European nations that were all vying for some kind of permanent foothold here, they realized very, very early on that they would need to have the alliance with as many tribes as possible if they were to become victorious or become the preeminent European sovereign here.
With the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1787, the different tribes were formally and legally recognized as independent sovereign nations, and as such would enjoy government-to-government relations exclusively with the federal government.
The Saginaw, Chippewas, the Ottawas, the Potawatomi signed the first treaty with the United States, the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. Because in that treaty, the United States recognized Aboriginal claims to the title of the land and the resources, and the tribes for the first time recognized the sovereignty of the United States.
You had the federal government reminding the states or the territories that were going to be formed that before you could become a territory, much less a state, you would have to swear off ever attempting to interfere in Indian affairs, because our relationship with the tribes was a nation-to-nation one.
The Bureau of Indian Affairs was officially created by Congress in 1824. The BIA operated within the War Department and originally had jurisdiction over matters of trade and treaties with all Native nations. The unique sovereign status of Native Americans was further defined by Supreme Court Justice John Marshall in 1831 with the introduction of the concept domestic dependent nations.
And so he crafted this new category, domestic dependent nationhood, for American Indian tribes, which placed us slightly lower on the hierarchy than the federal government, but slightly higher than the states.
Up until about 1800, tribal people in North America still possessed the military might if they chose. They could have driven non-Indians off of the continent. But after that, after 1800, you see a significant change in military technology, cannons, rifles, all that stuff, and then tribes lost that ability to do that.
In the 1830s, politicians and lumbermen turned their attention to the vast stands of timber in the Wisconsin and Minnesota territories. Anxious to begin logging the vast forests, the government sought to negotiate more land cession treaties with Ojibwe headmen. The Americans insisted on negotiating with a singular leader, as if he represented the entire nation of Ojibwe as one group.
This was done because the United States found it easier if it was dealing with one group. If it could get a handful of leaders to make decisions that would bind everyone, that would be just great from the United States point of view.
It was an alien concept to the tribes because the way they came to decide or make decisions was by consensus. And although there may have been principal leaders, there was always a discussion about who was to be the representative, and that even in their capacity as representative, they did not have the authority to make a decision for the entire tribe.
After the land cession treaties of 1837 and 1842, the Bureau of Indian Affairs passed from military control in the War Department to civilian control in the Interior Department. In 1849, the BIA was directed to implement the federal government's trust responsibility with the tribes. From the beginning, many of the BIA officials had close ties with powerful businessmen and politicians whose agendas contradicted the best interests of the tribes. In the mid-1800s, they discussed the removal of Ojibwe from Michigan and Wisconsin to land west of the Mississippi. Their goal was to escalate statehood for Minnesota by bringing the annuity payments and increased population there. The Ojibwe objected.
A delegation of Ojibwe people goes from the Great Lakes region, goes to Washington, D.C., and they carry with them a pictograph which demonstrates a point that they want to make, that in their hearts and in their minds, they are united as one people wishing to remain on their homeland.
In 1851, President Zachary Taylor ordered the removal of all Ojibwe from Michigan and Wisconsin to land west of the Mississippi. The annuity payments and census were moved to Sandy Lake in Minnesota. Representatives of each of the Ojibwe bands traveled to Sandy Lake to wait for promised payments that came months later. While waiting, 170 died due to illness and the ensuing winter storms that trapped them. Another 270 died on the long and difficult trek home, often called the Wisconsin Death March. Outraged, Ojibwe leaders sent a delegation to Washington to meet with President Fillmore. Leading the delegation was perhaps one of the most revered Ojibwe leaders, Bijiki, Chief Buffalo.
Chief Buffalo is a great-great-great-grandfather of mine, and I was told that at the time he made this trip with his delegation in 1852, that he was approaching his early 90s. It's always impressed me the fact that, there was so much concern over the plight of the Anishinaabe people in the fact that they might remove here, or the fact that they might have to engage in warfare with the United States. I often think of all of those factors as giving him the ability to physically just sort of go on this trip.
I think of what has passed and what is to come, and it makes my heart shake. When business comes before us, we will try to act like chiefs. If anything is done, it had better be done right.
Relations at this time between non-Indian residents of Michigan and Wisconsin and the Ojibwe were peaceful, and the Ojibwe were a key source of labor in remote northern communities. As a result, many citizens sent letters to officials asking that the Ojibwe be allowed to stay. After Buffalo's trip to Washington, the removal order was suspended, and soon after, Chief Buffalo and the other headmen signed the 1854 treaty at La Pointe on Madeline Island that designated permanent reservations for the Ojibwe in their homeland. The highly revered Chief Buffalo died soon after and was buried on Madeline Island. In the latter half of the 1800s, our leaders faced an aggressive assault from timber and mining interests. Settlers became increasingly intolerant of their Ojibwe neighbors. During this upheaval, new headmen emerged. Many urged restraint, accommodation, and adaptation in the face of American expansion. Other leaders called for a resistance to Western ways. Among them was Hole-in-the-Day the Younger, also known as the Boy.
We know the wants of the Ojibwe nation. No one knows them better than ourselves, and we cannot be blamed if we look after and take care of our own best interests. Now listen what I say. You see us here, we the Ojibwe. We want you to be friendly. We do not want a mock show.
By 1886, the state of Minnesota was putting extreme pressure on the Mille Lacs Band to join some of the Mississippi bands in removal to the newly established White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota. As pressure mounted from timber companies and settlers, politicians tried to force the Mille Lacs leaders into relinquishing Aboriginal title to their land.
You know, band members were driven from their homes. We had the sheriff from Mille Lacs County come and burnt the houses that the band members had and burnt all their belongings, everything, because they would not remove.
The county sheriff actually talked about digging a trench and dumping Mille Lacs people in underground, like was done with Wounded Knee. Many of them would have preferred to have died rather than having to go to White Earth or some other place to live.
As more settlers moved in, the Mille Lacs people faced the prospect of becoming trespassers on their own land. Miigwech spelled out their few options in this impossible situation.
First, we walk into the waters of the lake and die. Second, we march aimlessly into the wilderness never to return. And third, we fight for the redress of these wrongs.
Some Mille Lacs people did remove to White Earth because of the increasing violence of non-Indian townspeople towards the Ojibwe. Chief Miigwech traveled to Washington, D.C. to plead the case of his people, and in 1914, Congress set aside home sites for the Mille Lacs Ojibwe. However, they did not receive their individual land allotments until 1926, a year before Miigwech's death. With the outbreak of World War I, many Ojibwe men volunteered to join U.S. forces overseas, though they were not officially citizens of the United States. After the war, the Ojibwe and other Native Americans were granted full citizenship by an act of Congress in 1924.
And this is what I think confuses a lot of Americans, is that they know that Indians are citizens, but they're not quite sure what to do about our nationhood aspect. And so I try to remind them that we really are citizens as individuals, at least those tribes who want to exercise that. But our nationhood is first and foremost. And the United States still maintains that relationship because those 370 treaties are still valid legal documents. And those documents, once they were ratified, recognized our international as well as our national standing as separate governments.
1934, in the Roosevelt administration, John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs,
worked with the Congress, and the Wheeler-Howard Act was passed. It was also known as the Indian Reorganization Act. It was a way of restating that they were in fact sovereign entities within the United States.
The Wheeler-Howard Act was designed to reorganize Indian communities into tribal governments modeled after the United States, with constitutions and elected officials. This model imposed a very foreign system of government on Ojibwe tribes, and in some cases, it resulted in outright resistance.
Our tribe was not an IRA tribe. In fact, we didn't adopt the Indian Reorganization Act parliamentary form of government until 1967. Ours is a tribe that governed itself with a hereditary chieftain system. The Bureau of Indian Affairs established a business council and a tribal council, even though the Bureau of Indian Affairs wasn't authorized to do so. They attempted to hold some public elections, but the elections, of course, never came off. People just didn't show up to vote. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs maintained a hand-picked council throughout the late 30s and the 40s.
Collier may have intended reform as he described it, but the consequence of his programs was an Indian community run by the BIA, with an iron hand and depending on the silence of the Ojibwe until we had disappeared. Waaba-Ginu.
Each Ojibwe community had to file for federal recognition under the Indian Reorganization Act. Depending on certain criteria, such as the amount of their land, some bands were recognized, some bands were grouped together, and some bands were ineligible under the new law, causing considerable hardship and loss.
There are only 4 tribes in Michigan that were allowed to organize under the Wheeler-Howard Act. They had all petitioned for reorganization. When the Wheeler-Howard Act passed, there were high hopes for reestablishing tribal governments and making self-sufficient communities. Congress didn't share Commissioner Collier's enthusiasm, cut the budget, and made it impossible for the Bureau of Indian Affairs to live up to the high standards that Collier had set.
In 1939, 13 Ojibwe tribal governments had been federally recognized in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. 6 other bands were recognized by 1976. During World War II, Ojibwe soldiers were among the 25,000 Native American warriors fighting for the United States.
My own father was a veteran, and he said, well, this is your homeland. That's what you're fighting for. It's to protect what's yours. And so they all feel a deep commitment and responsibility. The number of men that enlisted, not only men but women. You know, there's a word that non-Indians use for patriotism, but I think it's kind of different for Native American people. It's, you know, it's really ownership.
Once again, our warriors returned from the war to face new assimilation policies at home.
In 1953, for whatever reason, the government decided that it wanted to terminate Indian tribes, so it passed 2 laws. One was House Resolution 108, which basically said we're going to start terminating some Indian tribes, which basically means we're going to give you a check and say you're not an Indian anymore. And the second one was Public Law 83-280, and that one essentially said that in 5 states, when it passed, criminal jurisdiction on the state is going to be taken over, on the Indian reservation is going to be taken over by the state.
Although the Ojibwe were never terminated, tribal members were pressured to leave reservations and move to urban areas as part of the relocation program. Those who remained on the reservations were regularly arrested for exercising their reserved hunting, fishing, and gathering rights guaranteed in the treaties.
I remember the story of Grandpa, and inevitably when he would show up at the house and we'd be around, and pretty soon he'd start looking for the shotgun, and Ma'd say, "What you doing, Dad?" And he'd say, "Well, I'm going to get some supper." And she, "You can't do that, they'll arrest you." You know, it's against the law. He said, they can't arrest me. We got treaty rights. My grandpa was there. He was there on Madeline Island when they signed that treaty. And he told me why they signed that treaty. Now, my grandpa wouldn't lie to me. If he says we got treaty rights, we got treaty rights. Off he'd go. Of course, he'd get arrested, throw him in jail. They'd steal our supper, and sometimes we needed that supper.
There was the American Indian Civil Rights Movement underway, and every time we'd hear about Alcatraz or the occupation, it would excite the young people. But I know it just discouraged the heck out of our tribal chairman. It's not the Indian way, he would say.
New leaders emerged from the urban tribal communities and the National American Indian Movement. This organization, which began in Minnesota, had national impact on tribal issues.
I wanted to be part of a group of people that was going to stand up for Native people. I wanted to be part, I wanted to move, I wanted to go and challenge the institutions and the policies that were restricting us, were putting us in prison. The all-white jury system, the all-white police system, the all-white judges in Minneapolis that were sentencing our people to prison left and right. I wanted to find out more about the BIA, why they weren't there to protect us in our hunting and fishing, and why we were being thrown off our own lakes in Minnesota by game wardens. That's where we were in 1968. The time had come, and people all over this country felt that that was enough. It's time to stand up and fight. And so the American Indian Movement was formed.
One of the first Ojibwe issues that AIM became involved with stemmed back to when the traditional Ojibwe village of Pakwewin in the Lakota Reservation was forcibly evacuated to accommodate flooding caused by the newly constructed winter dam. This dam permanently washed away the entire village, including the burial grounds. The occupation of the winter dam by tribal demonstrators and AIM members was one of many Indian protests during the 1970s, known as the Red Power Movement.
In 1971, the license for the Chippewa flowage and the winter dam came up for renewal. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, of course, advised us just simply to sign off on the renewal of the license for another 50 years. There was an organization that was formed, the Chippewa Flowage Alliance. And this alliance was composed of the vocal leaders who were opposed to the relicensing of the winter dam. And eventually it led to the takeover of the winter dam in the late summer of 1971. I was tribal chairman in 1985, so eventually, 14 years later, I actually signed the final agreement with the Northern States Power Company. And we gained from them an additional compensation of 3,000 acres of land on the lake and $150,000 of other compensation and the rights to the power generation of the dam at the site. So we did okay.
Indian tribes became more aware of their own civil rights and the distinctivenesses of their communities and began recounting their history in a way that mobilized political action. Along with that growth came a sense of renewed sovereignty and nationhood. The key defining feature of the sovereignty of these tribes is the treaty-based relationship with the United States.
And so when Dick Gurno and a small group of members from Red Cliff said, hey, we're going to test this thing, they went out and ended up getting cited, and that resulted in a state Supreme Court decision which said the right continued to exist.
The outcome of this litigation and subsequent cases resulted in the affirmation of Ojibwe hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on ceded territory. The Voigt decision of 1983 recognized the sovereign government status of the tribes.
There was no government-to-government relationship between any of the tribes and the state of Wisconsin. And the officials in the state of Wisconsin had a difficult time dealing with the fact that there needed to be this recognition of the tribes and their governmental power and authority.
As Ojibwe exercised their court-affirmed treaty rights, angry protesters resorted to violence and racial slurs towards tribal members. After numerous arrests, the state and the public finally accepted the validity of the treaties in contemporary times and the sovereign status of the Ojibwe. Today, there are 19 federally recognized sovereign Ojibwe bands in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. These bands were established based on the 1934 Wheeler-Howard Act model and operate autonomously with individual government-to-government relations with state and federal authorities. Tribal leaders are elected by members of the tribe, and each band governs within the framework of a constitution with their own individual approach to the organization of decision-making.
We developed what you call a separation of powers, and separation of powers actually is patterned after the United States. And the United States pattern theirs after the Iroquois nation. So it's an Indian concept.
They created the executive branch, in which the tribal chairman, through the Reservation Business Committee, obtained the title of chief executive. They created the legislative branch, which is basically equivalent to your Senate, Congress, in which they have the authority or power to create laws of the band. And the judicial branch, of course, interprets that law, on behalf or for the benefit of our band members.
They call us special interest groups, minority groups, whatever it is. But, we are a government. We do have laws, and we're not special interest. We're the first people on this continent that governed, self-governed our nations.
Tribes want the right to be able to do things from an economic standpoint, a political standpoint, a cultural standpoint, that follow the needs and the desires of their people. And so any action by the federal government or the state to interfere or impinge on the right of a tribe to act as a sovereign is deemed as a real threat.
Indians pay federal taxes, but if they live on a reservation, they work there, they don't pay state taxes. And one thing that's not discussed very much is how much money goes into a state from the payroll taxes of the casinos, and that's a pretty considerable amount.
But there are some things we have in common with cities, such as holding our own elections, enforcing our own laws, and promoting our own economic growth. We have jurisdiction over our own area with our own police force.
If you have enough information.
We are a government.
The tribes now administer self-determination contracts separately for law enforcement, social services, and natural resources. As a result of the Self-Governance Demonstration Project of 1988, Ojibwe tribal governments can now make compacts with the United States government to distribute funds in their own communities as they see fit.
And I first sat on the bench as an associate judge in '91 and became chief judge shortly after that. Our tribe is a sovereign nation, and first and foremost, I guess I'm what you would call a sovereign warrior. I'm going to defend our sovereignty. and our right to have a tribal council that's going to establish laws that are going to be enforced. And we're going to have a court where the people can come to be a place where peace can be restored. So we have adopted state law in our court. At the same time, we also have our own ordinances and laws. We were originally started in order for the Voight Agreement to begin prosecuting natural resource cases. And to this day, we're still hearing natural resource cases. Any member that is cited anywhere in the ceded territory, any member of our tribe, will be brought into this court. And the citation will be heard here. Our police department is a valid police department and can issue citations, and whether it's a violation of a state law or a tribal law. Now we're enforcing criminal matters here now. We started doing traffic cases, family court, and the more we went, the more jurisdiction we start assuming. Once we entered into an agreement with the county and signed a compact agreement with the county, that's when we became very, very effective. We just recently took over the child support and paternity cases of Vilas County. So we've helped out the county. Our elders charge me first to restore peace, and that's what I'm going to do. Any elder is a peacemaker, and I'll go consult the elders at any time. But we have two people, George Brown and Joe Chosa, who are trained peacemakers. Any person that comes into this court can choose peacemaking as an alternative to having a trial. A lot of people don't realize that. You know, you get cited for speeding, you come in here and ask for peacemakers to resolve it. And once you choose them, you know, stay with it. You can't come back and say, I think I'll, go with your way instead. It doesn't work that way. I have warrants issued for people who have not complied with conditions of the peacemakers. And so it's a valid option in our court. That's, I guess, how we differ from state court. So if you can give them something that is part of the culture and reestablish a sense of pride in being Ojibwe, they'll walk out of here, and that maybe that process will have begun so that peace can be restored.
The reality is that the government of the people is the people. That is where the power is with the people. And the leaders of the people are not all in government. They are all over. You have your language teachers. They are the keepers of culture. You have your drum societies. They are the keepers of our religions. Our Meday societies, the keeping of our healing traditions. Your educators who keep the continuity.
Perfect. A rice chief is a person that goes out into the lakes and checks the rice beds to find if the rice is ripe enough to pick. They have a lot of influence on the decision making. We have at least 4 of them in our community. So they play a vital role as rice chiefs.
Women that are women veterans are known to be Ogichidaa. They earn their right because of being in the service. And there are leaders too. Ikwe today are in a lot of different roles on the reservation. Tribal council, lawyers, teachers.
Anishinaabe, Ojibwe women continue their traditional roles in the decision-making process within families, clans, and communities.
Now, when I go to national meetings, I see a lot of women leaders now elected to their position by their own right. And I think because we get things done, that's what people see in us.
A standing ovation for Green Party Vice Presidential candidate Winona LeDuc as she campaigned today at UMD's Romano Gym.
We're the mothers of our nations, and as such, all responsibilities of our nation, or all issues of our nation, are of concern to Indian women. Elders continue to be highly respected and take on leadership roles in their communities.
To take on a role of leadership today is probably one of the most difficult tasks that any individual could undertake. Some folks may view that being in a leadership position is, exciting, wonderful, but that's, there's so much pressure today with everything.
There's no book. When you get elected to the Tribal Council, you open up a book and it says Tribal Council 101 or Tribal Chairman 105. There's nothing like that. Tribal councils today are dealing with all of the complexities that the city governments are dealing with, that state governments are dealing with. Not enough money, too many problems. It's a whole range of issues.
So it's really tough to be an Indian today, and tougher to be an Indian leader because of that. Because, today we have to wear many hats. When we sit, we have to listen to our people. We're supposed to be good listeners, and they expect us to be good stewards, good delegators, all of these things.
What you want to have in leadership is the ability to step down and not have to worry whether you have a job within your own community. If I run for the election and you run for the election, if you win, does that mean that I can't be employed with the tribe that I worked for in another capacity because they might be afraid of the knowledge and the wealth of information that you've gathered for 25 years? It's a sad day when we have to look at that in our own community, that you have to run, or those that have supported you in the past will all be taken out of office as a result of a change of leadership. If that happens, then I think I've failed. But that's the dilemma you face within the community. Is it's almost like it's an all or nothing, win or lose.
Many of our people coming back from places like Detroit, Flint, bringing back those values that are there, they've adapted that adversarial system well, and rather than being adversarial, we need to, move forward in a consensus manner. We need to move forward in trying to be unified as one. Our leadership in the past had said that, if we're kept separated, we can be defeated easy. If we unite, come together, it's difficult to take what is ours away.
Ojibwe leaders from Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Canada came together again at Madeline Island. They came to renew historic ties with their ancestors and this island. And they came to unify their support for the Mille Lacs Band, whose treaty case was coming before the Supreme Court at that time.
Because that was where the Anishinaabe people really started their journey to the different reservations from back in the early 18th century. We call it feasting the treaties. One of the
things that are part of the culture is that you're supposed to give these feasts with traditional foods to honor whether it be ancestors, treaties. In this case, it was to feast the treaties. We started off with a sacred fire, kept that fire burning for 4 days. Our commissioners came to the island. Canadian people came down.
They had people from each direction, from the 4 directions, come up and talk a little bit about that, about where they were from and what they represented and what was happening.
During Wednesday of that week, we had a signing of the protocol, the Anishinaabe Key Protocol, meaning Chippewa country, and recognizing that Chippewa country really extends beyond the borders, the international borders of the country of America and the country of Canada, and pledged our mutual support on resource matters and in cultural matters. They had a shaking tent ceremony to talk about, well, you know, what path should we take, what road should we go down, how should we do these things, and they got those answers in those ceremonies, and they followed that up with meetings between leaders, spiritual people, and lawyers.
I think my fulfilledness of that, I think, was the fact that I was given that opportunity to be with those great leaders of today. And as I sat there, I tried to vision what it was, you know, at the time before the houses were there, or how that was to be and how it was to come about. And I still do that today as I sit in the seats of our yesteryear leaders and how I need to portray myself as a leader for tomorrow. How we have to be strong. We have to be all of that. We have to have that sorrow in ourselves. We have to have that laughter. We have to have that strength. Because if we don't do that, then we don't send that message for the tomorrows to come, for our young people to be that way too. And I think that's what the Madeline Island did to me. And I think it brought unity once again back to the Ojibwe nation.
I heard a spiritual leader say one time, you know, if we had the ability to all come together in one mind, together just for once, we could lift the roof right off this building. If we all came together as one. That's my prayer.
We do kawa Anishinaabidaa Midashkaya geta Ojibwe moa Waasa-Inaabidaa Kakinaga Omanidu We do kawa Anishinaabidaa Midashkaya geta Ojibwe moa Waasa